So, our final discussion is going to give you a sense of a Roman world that almost happened but didn't. This is a world that, in some ways, wraps up the entire trajectory of this course of lectures we've talked through. The idea of a Roman state that secured the rights and properties of its citizens while continuing to expand the opportunities of everyone who could potentially help that state at whatever level they could potentially help the state. This world that almost happened but didn't is the world that was envisioned and nearly created by the Emperor Domitian. And it was a world that was cut short by Domitian's murder. Now, the beginning of Domitian's life is something that, or of Domitian's career, is something that builds right off of the end of his brother's short reign as emperor. This is the Emperor Titus. And Titus's great achievements were effectively coming to power as a figure who was greatly respected for winning the Jewish war and suppressing the Jewish revolt, and then reigning during a period where he was able to do all of the things that new emperors are able to do to promote popularity, and he had to do none of the things that were required to scale back the expenditures that made him popular in the first place. The most notable thing that Titus brought about was the dedication of the Colosseum. And here again, you see the image of the Colosseum, and you see the image of what games in the Colosseum would look like on this coin on the left. Now, Titus died prematurely in 81 AD, and he was succeeded by his brother Domitian. Now, Domitian was the younger son of Vespasian, and he took control of the empire following Titus's death in 81, and although few remember it now, Domitian very quickly came to be seen as a remarkably capable emperor. He presided over the beginnings of a revolution in both Roman urban and political life that over the course of the next century and a quarter would make the empire a place that fully integrated its subjects as citizens and built political structures so that Roman citizens across the entire empire would eventually be able to share in the rights given to Romans and also the opportunities provided to the most skilled, accomplished, and influential people who belonged to the Roman citizen body. This was, in a sense, the fulfillment of this promise that Cicero made, or this conception that Cicero had of what the Roman state actually was. Cicero's point, as we've seen a number of times, is this: a republic is something that belongs to citizens who agree on how they are to be governed, and then entrust the governance of that state to others who work in their name. But the people retain ownership of that state. And despite the fact that Rome was now an empire with an emperor in charge, this basic idea of a state that belonged to the people and not to the individual emperor was something that remained very, very important to Romans. And it could remain because the Roman state, in whatever form it took, was never egalitarian. The monarchy was never something where everybody had an equal voice in how things were decided. But at the same time, patricians and plebeians did play a role in the selection of Roman monarchs. And so the monarch was, in a way, determined by the will of the multitude of people who were joined together by a consensus about law and the common good. The Republic was something similar to this. The initial republic was an aristocratic counter-reaction to the later monarchy. But even in that context, the aristocrats who were elected were still elected to the consulship and to other offices by a vote that involved all people. Now, the votes of those people were not equal. By no means were they equal. And the only people who were eligible to hold the consulship early in the Republic were patricians. But still, the idea of a collection of Roman citizens coming together and exercising their common will to generate a consensus about law and common good was part of the Republic. And it was part of the Republic as the conflict of the orders expanded the availability of the consulship to plebeians. And it was also part of the Republic even to the very end when the Republic started coming apart. And ultimately, in the transition from the Republic to the Empire, what we saw was Octavian, soon to become Augustus, was able to get the support of Italians and the legitimacy to campaign against Antony in 31 BC by bringing together all of the people in Italy and having them swear an oath to back him. That was again a collection of people joined together by a consensus about the common good and about what was lawful. Augustus's empire grew out of that same principle. Again, it is not an egalitarian system, but Rome never was. Instead, what you have is a system in which Romans entrust their security to someone, and in the empire, that person ultimately responsible for their security was the emperor. And they gave their consent to do this in a number of ways. Now, Domitian's challenge was to figure out how it was that he could manage a process through which his power base remained broad enough to keep the empire peaceful. We saw with the Emperor Claudius, and also with the abortive attempts of the Emperor Nero, a real sense that emperors, to be successful in their jobs, needed to be aware of people of influence, means, and power who were not yet included in the senatorial aristocracy. And they needed to take steps to bring those people into that senatorial aristocracy so that you could bind them to the Roman Commonwealth. If you didn't do this, emperors recognized that they would eventually face rebellions by these people who, much like Italians in the Social War or plebeians in the early Republic, felt that their voices were not adequately represented in how decision-making was made, and they were not properly vested with influence in how the structure of the Roman state worked. And Domitian understood this. But Domitian's challenge, like the challenge that Claudius faced and the challenge Nero faced, was figuring out how to get Italian senators from old Roman families who, for generations, had sat at the highest level of the Roman political hierarchy to allow the emperor to bring in newer, richer provincials into the Senate. And it also meant getting Romans living in the capital to accept a much more culturally, linguistically, and religiously diverse capital than their ancestors had probably known. Because as Rome's provincial subjects became more integrated into the empire, more of them moved to the capital to pursue economic or political opportunities. And so if handled badly, the process of integrating these people would bring about a repeat of the immigrant roundups of the 120s and 100s BC, as well as the xenophobic tensions that ultimately led to the Social War. But Domitian handled it well. And there were a couple aspects to this. First, Domitian worked very, very hard to be sure that the center of Rome came to befit the center of a great imperial power. And so the center of Rome under Domitian got a real facelift. By the summer of 96 AD, Domitian ultimately was assassinated in September of 96. By the summer of 96 AD, a number of major projects had been either finished or nearly finished. One of them was what's now called the Forum of Nerva. This actually, by rights, should have been called the Forum of Domitian. Central to this was a temple to the goddess that Domitian particularly privileged. This was the goddess Minerva, and the structure was basically complete by the time that Domitian was assassinated and Nerva took over. But one of the problems of being assassinated, and we'll talk about this later on, one of the problems of being assassinated is your legacy is no longer something that people are willing to protect. And so even though this forum was designed and almost completely constructed under Domitian, it's now known as the Forum of Nerva. But this is just the last of a string of major projects that Domitian sponsored. So Domitian was responsible for rebuilding damaged temples, including one to the Egyptian gods Serapis and Isis that were patronized by Egyptians and others across the city. That again is the emperor giving some of his resources and some of his support to an institution that benefited Romans, but also, of course, benefited subjects of the empire. This is the bow towards inclusion and the forward-looking thinking of an emperor like Domitian. Domitian also built a new stone chariot racing stadium on what's now the Piazza Navona. And you can see here the way that the buildings are arranged in this kind of semicircle. This follows the plan of the original circus of Domitian. And actually, if you go to the end of the Piazza Navona, past where you see the Alsagno, there's actually a bank building, and you can go look down and see some of the foundations of Domitian's hippodrome in the basement of that building. Now, the physical space of the capital could be remade much more easily than the political landscape in the Senate. As we've seen, the massive Roman conquests of the 1st century and 2nd century BC had catalyzed a wave of territorial absorptions and then ultimately a wave of immigration from the provinces to the capital. But they'd also seen a movement in the other direction, where Roman colonists and carpetbaggers left Italy and spread across the empire's new territories. Some of these people, of course, are famous to us or well known to us because these are like the merchants who were killed when Jugurtha took the city of Cirta. And these are the business people that were killed when Mithridates rampaged through the Roman province of Asia in the 80s BC. But generally speaking, when these people went to the new territories, they did a very good job of integrating at the highest levels. And so these wealthy Roman businessmen frequently would marry into the local aristocracies in these regions, and they would have children who were actually much more politically well positioned than the nobles of, say, Asia or of Greece. But they also were much wealthier than many of the noble families in Rome, because some of the people they married into were aristocrats, really, really wealthy people who were, for example, the descendants of Hellenistic monarchs. And so initially what we see is that these relationships built very wealthy figures who remained in the provinces. They were Roman citizens, but they eventually, under the emperors came to realize that these people were a significant power base, far wealthier and far more potentially powerful than the Italian aristocrats that emperors from Augustus through basically the early Flavian period had been akin to interacting with. And so over time, under the Flavians especially, and under Domitian particularly, the almost exclusively Italian Roman Senate presided over by the Emperor Augustus had, by the end of Domitian's reign, become maybe 15 to 20% provincial. And the first wave of these non-Italian senators, as we saw under Claudius, came from places like southern Gaul, places that had a deep and close relationship with Italy, and they weren't very far away. The Tablet of Leon shows this. But by the 80s, senators from later colonies in North Africa and the Eastern Mediterranean had begun appearing too. And these provincials were newcomers to the senatorial stage. But as they became accustomed to the political dynamics of the capital, they came to realize that while their wealth exceeded that of many of the Italian elites, their influence had yet to rise accordingly. But Domitian recognized this. Domitian recognized that these newer, wealthier senators coming into power potentially gave him a power base that was more powerful than anything Italian elites could actually access. And what we see is a real shift in Domitian's reign. In the first years of his reign, he followed a pattern established by his father and his brother of restricting the consulship so that the main members of the consular party, especially the people who gave their names to the year, were family members of the imperial family. What would usually happen by this point is the initial consuls for the year would step down after perhaps a couple weeks or a month, and then over the year, more and more numbers of people would come in as what are called suffect consuls, kind of replacement consuls, as people resigned the office. And so instead of 2 consuls, years under the Flavians would have 6 or more, as people assume the consulship and then resign after a few months. And this is a great system because it allows these senatorial elites to share the honor of the consulship. But now not just 2 people share that honor. Now as many as 6 different families can have their generations fix on the consulship. But after the year 84, it's clear that Domitian seems to understand that there's a new way to use the consulship to expand his power base and incorporate new people into the highest levels of the senatorial elite. And so what Domitian starts doing is spreading consulships around so that established senators from historically accomplished families now hold office alongside prominent aristocrats from the provinces, and as the 80s give way to the 90s, prominent Greek aristocrats. And the growing connections between Eastern elites and the Emperor Domitian would serve him particularly well. A great example of this is at the end of the 80s, there's a revolt led by a man claiming to be the Emperor Nero, who has died 20 years before. But Nero is a particularly popular figure in the memory of the Eastern Mediterranean. And so the Parthian regime actually backs this false Nero and tries to bribe governors in the Eastern Mediterranean to support this false Nero against Domitian. What's interesting is some of the governors were Italian aristocrats. Those Italian aristocrats took the bribes. Others of the governors were Greek-speaking aristocrats, Greek senators. Those are the people you would expect would immediately be susceptible to the idea of a false Nero. But instead, they're grateful to Domitian for the support that he's shown them. And while the Italian aristocrats are willing to accept the bribes and support the false Nero, the Greek aristocratic governors support Domitian, and Domitian is able to put down this revolt. And so what we see is Domitian, like Claudius, but on a much larger scale, is consciously drawing together elite networks from around the empire in ways that bind them more tightly to imperial authority and involve them more deeply in provincial administration in a fashion that ensures that these figures remain loyal to Domitian. And so in this process, Domitian was laying the seeds of an empire run by and for Roman elites from across the Mediterranean, rather than an empire that belongs to the narrow group of Italians who had historically dominated it. And Domitian did this because he understood acutely that emperors were condemned to a life sentence of exercising imperial power. And if they did their job well, that sentence could be a very long one, like Augustus or Tiberius. If they did their job poorly, well, they could end up like Caligula or Nero. And so Domitian took power at the age of 29. And this gave him the perspective to understand that he had the potential to be in this office for 30 or 40 or maybe even 50 years. But at 29, he's both old enough to exercise the agency that an emperor could exercise, but young enough to understand that the empire he inherited would evolve slowly into something very different during his lifetime. And he understood that it was necessary for him to deploy strategies that would work over decades. Unlike a Republican general or an older emperor like Galba, Domitian wasn't in office, didn't plan to be in office, and didn't expect to be in office for a year or two. Short-term thinking was not to his advantage because short-term thinking would just store up problems that would become serious, and he would have to fix those problems later. And so what Domitian did instead was develop very long-term strategies that played out over time and resulted in stable outcomes that were perhaps not as spectacular as what he could generate in the short term, but over time, they would be better for the empire and they would be better for him. And so this strategic approach is something that's best shown by looking at the last war that Domitian planned, a war that he was about to set out for when he was assassinated. This is a campaign along Rome's northern Danube frontier. And it was a meticulously planned campaign, the success of which depended on the sort of complicated logistical, economic, and diplomatic management at which Domitian excelled. Now, perhaps 70,000 troops were being pre-positioned for this war when Domitian was assassinated in 96. And this was supposed to be the last in a series of grinding wars along the empire's northern frontiers. It saw a string of modest Roman victories, nothing particularly impressive, and not any large-scale conquests. Because what Domitian was trying to do was not absorb more territory and then deal with the problems of controlling and Romanizing and securing that territory. What Domitian was instead trying to do was to create a peaceful balance of power across the Roman frontiers so that the territory that the empire controlled in Germany and in the Balkans wouldn't be threatened from across the Rhine and Danube River. And what Domitian was able to do while he was Augustus was to wear down each of the German tribes on the other side of the border and negotiate peace terms that they were willing to accept, but also that secured Rome's best interests in that region. Now, contemporaries later mocked Domitian's triumphs over these German adversaries as unimpressive, But what the emperor had managed to do was to stabilize the Rhine frontier to such a degree that he was able to withdraw 2 legions from it. And the campaign that Domitian was planning in 96 would have been against the last 3 tribes near the Danube who remained hostile to Rome, and it seemed likely to bring similar calm to Rome's northeast. And it's actually interesting how this was done. You see on this map where it says Regnum Dacia. The Regnum Dacia was a kingdom, a Dacian kingdom, across the Danube, and Domitian fought a war against the Dacians. But what we see in the aftermath of the war against the Dacians is Domitian does not conquer Dacia. What Domitian decides to do instead is negotiate a peace treaty with Dacia and arrange to have transport rights across the Dacian kingdom. He then sends engineers and architects to go and build a road network so that Roman troops can transition across Dacia and attack people from the other side. People who were threatening the Roman Danube frontier, they could be attacked both from Roman territory and from Dacian territory. Now, if we look at later sources, they talk about this as a horrible capitulation to the Dacians. The Domitian wins a war against the Dacians and responds by building infrastructure in Dacia. But this would be sort of like looking at the Marshall Plan as an American defeat after the victory in World War II. What the Romans were actually doing, what Domitian was actually planning, was to use the victory over Dacia to bind Dacia in an alliance structure that would secure the frontier in the long term, rather than just win a victory, make Dacians upset, and eventually lead to another campaign in 10 or 20 years that Domitian would have to fight against Dacia. This was supposed to be a durable peace structure, a durable alliance structure that would bind everyone along Rome's northern frontiers to a set of arrangements that would ensure the peacefulness of Roman territory south of the rivers. So for 15 years, by 96 AD, for 15 years, Domitian had improved life in the city of Rome. He defended the empire's frontiers. He'd fostered the emergence of a more geographically inclusive elite order that spanned the empire. This looks like a recipe for a successful imperial regime. It looks like the sort of thing that would make for an emperor who is extremely popular. But none of these things endeared Domitian to the old Italian aristocrats who still dominated the Senate. They could be a particularly ornery lot, especially for an emperor like Domitian, who came from a family that was, in some ways, not as esteemed as, say, some of the families of this old senatorial aristocracy. And not only could these people be ornery, but Domitian's temperament posed some particular problems. Because Domitian was a young man when he took power in 81, and even in 96, he was 44 years old, he still presided over a Senate filled with a significant number of people who had begun their careers in the reigns of Nero or even Claudius. And although he was the son of an emperor, a lot of these people looked down at Domitian as the son of people who had been equestrians. His lineage, for example, was a lot less distinguished than that of Caius Calpurnius Piso Crassus Frugi Licinianus, who's a descendant of a number of very prominent Republican politicians, including the triumvir Crassus. And this Crassus, this 1st century AD Crassus, was an idiot, but he was also an idiot who believed that the imperial position was sort of his birthright. And he looked at Domitian's string of steady but modest military and economic successes, and he wasn't particularly intimidated. But even more dangerously, Domitian was a lot younger. And this meant that barring a coup or an unexpected illness, the position of emperor was likely closed off to that generation of people who had come to prominence under, say, Nero or Claudius. But it was also closed off to the generation of people who had become prominent under, say, Vespasian or even Titus. And so Domitian understood that there were 2 and maybe even 3 generations of imperial aspirants who looked at Domitian and saw him as blocking their ability to seize imperial power. And he understood that this was a risk. He understood that Italians were upset that provincials were getting positions and getting prominence and getting offices that Italian elites felt like belonged to them. He also understood that there were people who really wanted to overthrow him simply because they wanted a shot at being emperor too. And Domitian's vigilance in protecting himself against these threats occasionally bordered on paranoia. He investigated and punished plots, and many of these plots were real, but some of them probably were not. But Domitian was not ignorant of the reaction to this. Domitian's punishment of people for these kinds of behaviors was something that fueled suspicions and fear among certain senators. And Domitian understood what could be done about this. So Domitian is even once said to have held a dinner party in which he basically, well, made fun of the tendency of these people to expect the worst of him. So this is the story as told by Cassius Dio. They said that Domitian at this dinner party entertained the foremost senators and knights in the following fashion. He prepared a room that was pitch black on every side, the ceiling, the walls, and the floor. And he had made ready bare couches of the same black color resting on the uncovered floor. Then he invited his guests in alone at night without their attendants. And first he set beside each of them a slab shaped like a gravestone, bearing the guest's name and also a small lamp such as hang in tombs. And next, beautiful naked boys, likewise painted black, entered like phantoms, and after encircling the guests in an awe-inspiring dance, they took up stations at their feet. Every single one of the guests feared and trembled and was in constant expectation of having his throat cut at the next moment. The more so, as on the part of everybody but Domitian, there was dead silence, as if they were already in the realms of the dead. And the emperor himself only conversed on topics related to death and slaughter. And then finally, when the dinner ended, he dismissed them. But he first removed their slaves who'd stood in the vestibule, and now gave his guests in charge of other slaves whom they did not know, to be brought either in carriages or in litters back to their homes. And by this procedure, he filled them even with far greater fear, because of course they are afraid that these are people who are assassins who are going to kill them before they get home. But then scarcely had each guest reached home and was beginning to get his breath again, when word was brought to him that a messenger from the Augustus had come. And while they were accordingly expecting to perish this time in any case, one person brought in the slab, which was of silver, and then others in turn brought in other various articles, including the dishes that had been set before them at dinner, which were constructed of very costly material. And thus, after having passed the entire night in terror, they received the gifts. And so what Domitian is doing here, I think, it's quite funny in its way. Domitian knows that these senators and these equestrians are deathly afraid of him. And so he has a dinner party in which he basically allows them, and this is basically a Roman version of a Halloween party, he basically allows them to completely give way to the fear that he's going to assassinate them. He knows they are all thinking he's going to assassinate them. And all of the decor, all of the place settings, everything about this entire event, even the conversation topics, is designed to heighten their fear that Domitian is going to do something to them. But then ultimately, at the end of it, instead of Domitian killing them, Domitian instead gives them very expensive gifts. And what Domitian is doing here is a couple of things that I think are really fascinating and speak in a really fascinating way about the kind of person Domitian was. First of all, what Domitian is doing is he's acknowledging that he has a reputation and that people are terrified of him. But he's also telling people that in essence, this reputation it's not one that they should actually take seriously. He's having a joke with them. And for the people who participated in this joke, they're actually richly rewarded for this, even though they had no idea what Domitian was actually up to. But this is exactly the problem that Domitian has. It's a similar problem to what Tiberius has after the murder of Sejanus, but it's even more serious because the misunderstandings between Tiberius and the Senate were less serious than the misunderstandings between Domitian and the Senate. And so these misunderstandings, this sort of stuff where Domitian plays these kinds of games with senators, Domitian might have thought this was funny, but they certainly didn't. And on September 18th of the year 96, a toxic combination of the emperor's suspicion, the ambition of a certain senator from an old elite family, and the fear of the emperor's wrath by some members of the imperial household fell upon Domitian, and he was assassinated that afternoon while he was taking a nap in his chambers. Now, the death of Domitian is something that profoundly shocked people. And it shocked them even more because the person who replaced Domitian was a man named Marcus Caecus Nerva, a member of an old Italian aristocratic family that belonged to that generation that looked at Domitian and felt first that they were not going to have their shot at imperial power, and second, were intensely discontented by the fact that Domitian was bringing in all of these people from other parts of the Roman world and bringing them into, not only bringing them into the Senate, but bringing them into the highest senatorial offices like the consulship. And what we see with Nerva's coup is a very clear reaction against this, where the consular list, the first consular list that Nerva creates, is not made up of people from the East or people from Spain. It's made up of good Italians, of old Roman aristocratic stock. Now, the other thing that Nerva's coup means is not only is there this transition between the process that Domitian was using to create a new empire, but there's also a very clear, almost whiplash-inducing reaction among people who were once close to Domitian. Because what Nerva has to do to justify the murder of the emperor is claim that the emperor was so terrible, there was no other option available. And so Nerva's coup means that Domitian is roundly abused by ancient historians. And some of the best known Roman historians, rhetoricians, and biographers of all time were writing in the immediate aftermath of Domitian's reign. These are men like Tacitus, Suetonius, Plutarch, and Pliny. And these people are particularly aggressive against Domitian because all of them had benefited from Domitian's patronage. And so all of them then needed to overcompensate for the favor that Domitian showed them by turning against him really aggressively after the emperor's shocking murder. This was seen as a kind of active reactive loyalty, where what they are doing in essence is saying they're loyal to Nerva because they're attacking the character and the legacy of this person that had benefited them so much. And Tacitus is probably the worst of these. Not only did Tacitus himself serve in a string of government positions under Domitian, but he was also the son-in-law of Julius Agricola, a general who had particularly distinguished himself as in military service under Domitian. And so after the assassination of Domitian, a damnatio memoriae was voted for Domitian. But those who cooperated with the regime also became suspect. And so the Agricola is Tacitus's attempt to clear Julius Agricola of charges of working with the regime. And if we're being honest, this would have been probably quite surprising to Agricola himself, who died before Domitian and had no idea that the service that he'd rendered to Rome and the service that he'd rendered to the emperor might at some point be something that would call into question his character. So Tacitus is trying to retroactively defend Agricola for cooperating with a regime that Agricola never actually imagined would be problematic to cooperate with, but that Tacitus feels like he must explain away because he's writing under the reign of Nerva and Trajan, after the memory of Domitian has been attacked. And so what Tacitus does is he attributes all of Agricola's work under Domitian to something that relies on Domitian kind of subtly forcing Agricola to do things. And so there are examples of this throughout the Agricola. So following a victory won by Agricola, Tacitus writes, "News of the victory was received by Domitian with a smile on his face that so often masked a secret disquiet, because he was bitterly aware of the ridicule that had granted his sham triumph over the Germans." And so what Tacitus is saying here is actually quite interesting. We saw earlier when we looked at the reign of Tiberius that Tacitus has a really great gift for talking about things and then reading motivations into them. And so when he's talking about the actions are probably legitimately described. But the motivations, this is where Tacitus really gets into attacks on the character of people like Tiberius or Domitian. So if we look at this, the literal story is Domitian hears of a victory that Agricola won, and he smiles. That's what actually happens. That's what an observer would witness. But beneath this, Tacitus ascribes a motivation. He says that the smile on his face is a disingenuous smile. It's a smile that reflects his own inadequacy and his own sense that he knows he's inadequate, because the triumph that he had won under the Germans was a sham. Now, in reality, of course, as we've seen, it wasn't a sham triumph. It reflected something that was a war that had limited objectives, that was designed to facilitate diplomatic arrangements. But that doesn't matter. What we have here then is the beginning of a strategy that Tacitus is going to deploy throughout. And it's a strategy where Agricola will do things and Domitian's actions in response seem perfectly normal. But Tacitus will undercut the significance of those actions by making up motivations for why Domitian is behaving as he was. So, for example, in the years following Agricola's British campaign, there's another set of military reverses, and Domitian calls upon Agricola to come out of retirement and take over another military province. And Tacitus says that Domitian actually he pleads with Agricola to take this position. And so what Agricola then says is, I really just can't do this. I'm tired, I'm old, I don't want to do this. And in response, Tacitus says, the emperor had his hypocrite's part prepared. He put on a majestic air, listened to Agricola's request to be excused, and after granting it, allowed Agricola to thank him. And so what we have here again is a conversation that very well could have played out as Tacitus describes. Domitian asks Agricola to take over a military command. Agricola says, in essence, I'm too tired, I don't want to do that. And then Domitian says, I understand, thank you for considering this. It's a perfectly normal interaction. It's a perfectly believable interaction. But what Tacitus describes here is a perfectly normal and believable interaction that has deep and dark undertones, where in this interaction, Domitian is actually playing a role of a kind of evil and malicious figure who grants the request, but also starts sort of plotting in his mind what he's going to do in response. And so from Domitian's perspective, what we can understand is the emperor's behaving like emperors behave. What we also need to understand is Tacitus has this remarkable gift for taking the mundane experiences and interactions of people in power and their subordinates and ascribing really negative ideas and negative motivations to what the people in power are doing. And so Domitian comes across as a tyrant, not so much because of what he did, but because of motivations that Tacitus ascribes to those actions. And the actions themselves can be proven to be correct or incorrect. The motivations are impossible to recover because, of course, Domitian is dead. And so Tacitus looks like a reliable source for both the deeds, where he probably is a reliable source, and the motivations, where he almost certainly is not. Now, Suetonius is much more clumsy than Tacitus. But Suetonius, in a way, also has a really complicated task in attacking the legitimacy of Domitian, because Suetonius also benefited from Domitian. He got his start as a lawyer practicing in Rome under Domitian. But Suetonius is particularly brutal to the emperor. And it's interesting because Suetonius is in Rome during the reign of Domitian, but the life of Domitian is actually one of the shorter lives in Suetonius's Lives of the 12 Caesars. And so what we see here is a very careful construction of a narrative of who Domitian was. And Suetonius wants you to, again, believe that Domitian is a brutal figure. And so he tells this story near the beginning of the life. At the beginning of his reign, Domitian used to spend hours in seclusion every day, doing nothing but catching flies and stabbing them with a sharpened pen. Consequently, when someone once asked whether there was anyone in there with the Caesar, Vibius Crispus made the witty reply, not even a fly. And this is the kind of memorable story. I think most people who have ever read Suetonius' Life of Domitian, this is the story they remember because it's so weird. And Suetonius is, of course, aware of that. He's aware that this is the story you're going to remember. He's aware it's weird, and he's aware that the witty reply that Vibius Crispus makes is what makes the story memorable. Does this ever actually happen? Maybe. Maybe Domitian actually sat in his study and stabbed flies. Maybe not. It's hard to say. But the story itself serves Suetonius' purpose of giving you a view of his version of Domitian, a kind of deluded and vicious, tyrannical person who revels in doing violence simply for the fact that he could do it. Now, how much should we trust Suetonius' Domitian? Well, one of the things that I think really should make us doubt seriously what Suetonius is saying is this passage. Domitian never once stopped plotting, secretly or openly, against his brother. And so when Titus fell suddenly and dangerously ill, Domitian told the attendants to leave him for dead before he'd actually breathed his last. And afterwards, he granted him no recognition at all, beyond approving his deification. Now think for a second of how weird that statement is. Domitian did nothing at all for his brother's memory, except allow him to become a god. That would seem to be quite a bit that one would have done for one's brother's memory if you allow that brother to become a god. That's a pretty significant step. But at the same time, even the idea that Domitian did nothing more than approve the deification of Titus, even that is easily disproven because of this, the Ark of Titus. If you're going into the Roman Forum from the Colosseum, you will walk right by this. And this is an ark that is dedicated, as it says, to the divine Titus, the son of the divine Vespasian. And this ark was put up by Domitian. And in the center of it is a picture of Titus ascending to heaven on an eagle, representing his deification. So everyone in Rome knew that what Suetonius was saying here was actually not correct. You know, that Domitian actually was a very dutiful brother. He actually did quite a bit to honor Titus. And the evidence for this is still very clearly visible to this day. Other things that Suetonius says about Domitian are equally suspect. So Suetonius describes his military campaigns as necessary at times, but generally unnecessary. Here again, this is an author taking advantage of the fact that what Domitian was doing in those military campaigns was part of a much more elaborate and complicated strategy that involved both the military force that Rome could muster and also diplomatic relationships with the adversaries that Rome was trying to control. Were those campaigns necessary? Yes, but they were limited. And so there's no massive dramatic victories leading to the conquest of Germany that Domitian undertakes. But the campaigns are in fact necessary because they do have a larger strategic goal that Domitian is trying to bring about. Suetonius also says that the games Domitian gave were overly extravagant, even though they're very similar to the games that Titus gave that Suetonius praises. Suetonius also makes Domitian look particularly cruel and suspicious. He says that he suspected many people of plotting against him. He said, that this was unjustified, but everyone who knew, and the people reading Suetonius absolutely knew, about Domitian's career knew that Domitian did have to fight a civil war against a general who had built a base of support among the legions in Germany. And so the threats that he's responding to are real. But Suetonius then goes on to describe in overly dramatic terms Domitian's paranoia, his lustfulness, and the events that led to his assassination. And so this would seem to be a generally awful character on the level of a kind of Caligula figure, who people loathed. But there's a lot more reason to believe that Suetonius is not giving us the full picture of the popularity Domitian enjoyed. Because in speaking about the events after Domitian's death, Suetonius describes something interesting. He says that the people received the news of his death with indifference, but the soldiers were greatly grieved and at once attempted to call him the divine deified Domitian, while they were also prepared to avenge him if they had any leaders. But this, however, they did accomplish a little later by most insistingly demanding the execution of his murderers. Now, Suetonius is understating to some degree the support that the soldiers had for Domitian, because not only is the anger of the soldiers very real, it's something that they act upon. There's a coup by Praetorian guards against Nerva that almost leads to the overthrow of the emperor, and then not long after that, there are a series of negotiations between Nerva and people loyal to the governor Trajan, a military commander who's greatly revered by his soldiers. And it's clear from what comes out of that negotiation that if Nerva did not come to an agreement with Trajan, and ultimately he agrees to adopt Trajan as his designated successor, if Nerva had not done that, Trajan had soldiers who were willing to march on Rome to overthrow Nerva. So Domitian's popularity with the soldiers is very, very real. And the senatorial cabal and Nerva and the Italian elites that Nerva is catering to really struggled to keep those soldiers from overthrowing Nerva's regime. But, Suetonius says, the senators were so overjoyed that they raced to fill the curia, where they did not refrain from assailing the dead emperor with the most insulting and stinging kinds of outcries. And as we said, they voted a damnatio memoria against Domitian. And there you see the excision of Domitian's name from an inscription in Philippi in Greece. So what are we to make of this? Well, in the end, Domitian's murder represents the end of the gradual revolution in Roman military, economic, and political life that he'd been superintending. And it was a revolution that almost certainly would have worked. What we would have seen had Domitian lived out, say, 25 more years, was a deep integration of the East and the West, a senatorial order that was increasingly made up of people from diverse geographical backgrounds, an imperial regime that had secured peace along the northern frontier, and also had built a significant power base by incorporating people of means and of influence from around the Eastern Mediterranean. And in some ways, this is what actually did happen over the next 25 years. By the 120s, the Emperor Hadrian was building a regime that in many ways looked like what Domitian was trying to build, because the revolution that Domitian was trying to bring about was necessary. It was the next phase in reconfiguring and allowing the continued evolution of a Roman polity that had grown geographically and now was working to fully integrate the leading members of this massive territorial expanse that stretched from the Atlantic Ocean to basically the Judean desert. It was a huge project, and Domitian had an approach towards it that really would have worked, and with modifications, ultimately did work. Nerva's regime, which tried to roll a lot of this back, was a disaster. Nerva was looking to the past, and the Roman state, when it looked to the past, was an unstable thing. The Roman state needed to be forward-looking. It needed to be working to continuously bring in those new people who had been dominated by the Romans as subjects, and then later made into citizens. The Roman state needed to take advantage of their talents and incorporate them into the ruling structure of the empire. And Nerva was not about that. And Nerva's regime almost collapsed because of it. Nerva's successors, in fact, brought about a modified version of what Domitian was trying to build. And in some ways, it was a worse version. The Emperor Trajan is the first Roman emperor who was not born in Italy. This is very much in some ways consistent with the kind of empire that Domitian was building. Trajan was born in Spain, and so it is in a way a fulfillment of the project Domitian was superintending. It's also interesting that Trajan himself served as consul under Domitian and helped Domitian put down a revolt. And so this is somebody who possibly would have had a position of great influence even had Domitian continued to live. But Trajan had a different view of what the Roman frontier ought to look like. Domitian felt that a stable frontier would permit more building domestically, a better economy, a better set of structures, a better sort of looking city of Rome, and more attention to the needs of the actual citizens and subjects living in the Roman state. Trajan used the resources that Domitian had built up and exploded back out into wars of conquest. And in the end, this leads to a future for the Roman Empire in the 2nd century that was similar to, but less stable than, what Domitian was looking to build. And so when we think about how we should conclude this discussion of earliest Roman history, I think that the future that Domitian's death eliminated is a future that is, in some ways, very much in keeping with the basic principles of what Rome was all about. The basic principles of representation, inclusion, and growth in a way that encourages the continual rejuvenation of the Roman citizen body and the particular attention to what these new citizens can do when given the full opportunity to contribute to the state. This is what Domitian was trying to do. And the empire that Domitian did not succeed, the revolution that Domitian did not succeed in completing, was nevertheless something that was very consistent with the path the Roman Empire would eventually take. And it's much, I think, to the discredit of people like Suetonius and Tacitus and Pliny and Plutarch, that they understood in all likelihood what Domitian was trying to do, and they give him no credit for it. Instead, they buy into the anti-Domitianic propaganda issuing from some of the very people that Domitian's regime benefited. In the end, this, I think, gives us a sense of the good and the bad of what the Roman state was like. The general trends in Rome are trends that incline towards inclusion, incline towards optimizing the contributions of its citizens, and incline towards that basic principle that Rome is something that belongs to a community of people who agree on basic standards for law and the common good. But Rome doesn't always go in that direction. And Domitian's death is in some ways an indication that even when Rome's long-term trends were going in that positive direction, short-term events could overwhelm them. And people who really understood those long-term trends might fall victim to people trying to take advantage of immediate situations that made people uncomfortable. And this is always the challenge with a state that is evolving, and a state that is changing, and a state that is not static. Change can be a good thing, but even change that leads to a good outcome makes people uncomfortable. And if Roman history shows anything to us, it shows that opportunistic individuals are always willing to take advantage of the discomfort that change brings about. That person today was Nerva, but that person in other moments are people like Cato the Elder, people like Sylla, people who understand that discontent or even just unease can be mobilized for violent outcomes. And this is a curse that Rome never completely escapes. But the opportunity, I think, is the opportunity for Rome to reinvent itself progressively, to make itself a better place, to incorporate better people with better skills in its ruling structure. This is the promise that I think we can embrace. We should be fearful of the actions of people like the Nervas of the world, but we should also very much think positively about these larger trends that can perhaps be disrupted temporarily by these short-term reactions, but the larger trends do generally incline towards a better future. And this is the story of the Roman state as it grew from the monarchy to the Roman Empire.